Hello, everyone. I think we all intuitively understand that the amount of knowledge there is in a particular economy will have a big impact on what that economy can do. Well, to talk about that today, we are joined by Ricardo Hausmann. Now, Ricardo is the Rafik Hariri Professor of the Practice of International Political Economy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's the founder and director of the Harvard Growth Lab. Now, in this episode, he's going to talk about how do we measure the amount and diversity of knowledge there is in a specific economy. And this episode is actually quite personal to me because we spend a lot of time talking about Australia. What is the level of knowledge and diversity inside the Australian economy? Because this helps us not only understand what we can do now as an economy, but it also dictates what we can do in the future. Ricardo, welcome on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I grew up in Venezuela, a child of Holocaust survivors, and they went to school until the age of 12, more or less. So when I finished high school, I had the idea that I wanted to become a physicist. They wouldn't give scholarships for physics. I got a scholarship to study engineering and applied physics in the US at Cornell University. I started to take all my electives in philosophy, and one day I took an elective in the philosophy of science, and what I took out of that course is that social sciences, which I had a very low opinion of because I thought they were for dumb people, are actually epistemologically harder than the natural sciences because people act in a way that they think about the world, and electrons don't have that problem. They respond to fields and so on, and epistemologically they're harder. So I suddenly developed the idea that the social sciences were just younger and harder, and that's why they hadn't made as much progress. So I took a course in economics, fell in love with economics, and then I switched my application for the PhD from physics to economics, and I got my PhD in economics with the idea that I wanted to go back to Venezuela. So if I go back as a physicist, there was no physics in Venezuela going on, very little. I had spent my summers working at the National Science Lab in the physics department, but it had nothing to do with like the physics department at Cornell. So I said, if I go back as an economist, electrons are the same everywhere, but economies are not, so it would make more sense. And I also thought that over the course of my lifetime, economics was going to do much more progress than physics because physics was already old and developed. I think I was wrong on everything. I ended up spending the last 25 years of my life in the US. And secondly, I think that physics has done a hell of a lot of progress. I'm not sure that economics has. So I ended up being an economist. I've had a lot of fun being an economist. I've never completely forgot my roots in physics, and so I've always been very, very much thinking of the economy more, with my physics intuitions.
I know you have many areas of research, and we'll touch on some of these, but how would you describe your sort of underlying philosophy on the economy?
Well, the way the way economics tells students what the economy is made out of is they say it's made out of effort, labor, something called human capital, that they think of it as a one-dimensional thing. Some people have a lot, other people have very little, and something called capital. So they call it labor, capital, human capital, and then they put a fuzzy term there called technology. And they think of these four things as what we would call in mathematics scalars, right? So it's just a number, not a vector or a matrix, just a number, right? And so you try to explain things in the world by referring to these substances. How much labor does the economy have? How much human capital does the economy have? And And they think of that human capital as the scalar saying how many years of schooling on average people have, or maybe corrected for how good quality of education they have, and quality is measured how well people do on the same exam, right? The PISA exam, right, etc. And then how much capital, how much labor, how much of this human capital measured in this way, and then everything else they call technology. And it's just, they think of it as a shift parameter, something that if you have more of it, everything becomes more productive. If you have less of it, everything becomes less productive. That's why they call it total factor productivity. It's something that determines the productivity of everything else. And that's your description of the world. And when you try to describe the world in that way and ask yourself the question, why is Venezuela not growing? Why is Latin America not catching up? Why is so many poor countries in the world? The story is everything is in the A, in this shift parameter that is like none of the above category. It's not labor, it's not capital, it's not human capital, it's kind of like everything else. They also like to call it technology. Mm-hmm. That is the description of the world of a neoclassical economist, of standard mainstream economics. I developed a little bit the intuition that that way of splitting the world is not useful. It's as if the Greeks had split the world between earth, water, air, and fire, and those are the substances which the world is made out of. Now, if you try to explain the world with those substances, earth, water, air, and fire, it's very hard to explain most of the things in the world, right? There is no chemistry, there's no biology, there's nothing, right? So you don't know how you go from, I don't know, a living organism to earth, water, air, and fire. So, an alternative view of the world is that the world is made out of atoms. These atoms are themselves made out of things, protons, neutrons, electrons, etc. But as far as things above atoms are concerned, what really matters is the outer layers of the atom, which determine how they combine with other atoms. So now suddenly you have atoms, and you have atoms that combine into molecules, and molecules that can become very large molecules, and maybe you have combinations of many, many molecules that you might call a cell, and maybe you might have multi-cell organisms like us, and maybe you have many us's, and then you have a city, right? So you see that every time that you combine the underlying things, you get some other structure above that has some emergent properties that are not properties of the underlying elements. One way we also like to use the metaphor, not of atoms, which are in the periodic table, are a bunch of letters, and molecules, which are kind of like these chains of letters. It's also intuitive to think of them as words and, letters and words. And maybe you can go from words to sentences, and the meaning of a letter has nothing to do with the meaning of a word. Yeah. The meaning of a word is not very related to the meaning of a whole sentence, right? And a sentence is different from a paragraph, from a chapter, from a book, right? So these things combine in that way. So the way I think of the world is that we humans live in this world, but cannot survive in this world unless we change the world. Ooh. That the world as is doesn't suit us. We are not. All the other animals try to find an ecosystem that supports them. We transform the world to support us. One way I like to say it is that the world has the shape it has. We want it in the shape of a hamburger. If you want a hamburger, there are no hamburger trees. So it's not that we're going to find a wild hamburger tree, or you're going to cultivate a hamburger tree. No, if you want a hamburger, there's a lot you have to change in the world. You have to somehow get to bread by making cereals. You have to get to meat by domesticating animals, and you have to get to cheese, you have to get to tomatoes, you have to a lot of stuff, right? So you have to transform the world. Now, if you're a physicist, you might say, well, to transform the world, you need mass, you need energy. But that's kind of like the boring part. To transform the world, the most important part is that you need to know how to transform the world. So what we actually use to transform the world is the knowledge on how to transform the world. Even the knowledge of where the mass is and where the energy is and how to use the energy. It's also all driven by knowledge. And you can think of knowledge as coming in two classes of knowledge. Okay? One is knowledge about the nature of the world. Okay? What's out there? How does it work? Okay? We call that science.
Yes.
And then there is knowledge about how to change the world. And that's what we call technology. So the economy is made out of people knowing how to do things in the world, how to transform the world, not just the physical world, even the social world, right? I mean, the knowledge of how to make entertainment, right? Knowledge about how to administer taxes. So it's all, to do something, you have to know how to do it. And then you ask yourself the question, where the hell is that knowledge? Where is it? Where is it? Can I touch it? Can I taste it? Does it smell? What is its geography? What's this substance? And I think this substance is kind of unique. It comes really in three flavors. When you read a recipe, it says, take onions, apples, tomatoes, put them in a skillet, put them at this temperature or whatever, It doesn't tell you how to make the skillet. Right? It doesn't tell you how to make the energy that went into cooking, right? So that knowledge about how to make the skillet, you don't need to have it. You just need the skillet. So in some sense, that knowledge is embodied in the skillet. So one form that knowledge takes is in the form of tools and materials. The knowledge into making the tool or the material is already embedded in the tool or the material. You don't need to know how to make a skillet to use a skillet.
Yes.
The second form this knowledge takes is in the form of codes, recipes, formulas, algorithms, how to do manuals, like our cookbook, right? That was telling us how to cook. So there, the knowledge exists in some symbolic space, right? It's a set of zeros and ones, or it's letters and words, and so on. So it's been codified into some kind of symbolic language. So it exists kind of like in that space. So if you want to know how to cook a particular dish, you can read the cookbook, right? So that's a second form it takes, codified knowledge. But if you've ever tried to cook in your life, you'll realize following a cookbook that there's a lot in the cookbook that you might not fully understand, or you might not know how to adapt because the tomatoes were a little bit ripe or a little bit green, and you didn't have this. You might have substituted with something else. That thing, for example, when you go to a dentist, the dentist uses tools, and the dentist follows some codes, some protocols of what he's supposed to do. But the reason why you go to a dentist and not to your wife and give her the tools and let her read the protocols is because to be a dentist, you need to know more than is embodied in the tools and in the protocols or in the codes. You need something that has to be in the person's head, and that's what we call know-how. Okay? Now, there's knowledge and there's know-how. Like, knowledge is kind of understanding. Know-how does not involve understanding. Know-how is just, what a good violinist uses, right? He knows how to play the violin. He cannot explain it to you. And by the way, if you have a conversation with Jascha Heifetz or any of the great violinists, your ability to play the violin will not improve a bit. So it's not right. It's not something that moves from brain to brain by just talking about it. Malcolm Gladwell says in his book Outliers that it takes 10,000 hours to become good at something, and we don't have 10,000 hours to spare in our life. 10,000 hours at 40 hours a week is about 5 years. So it takes a long time to train the brain to use that know-how. So we have this very, very slow process of putting kind of know-how into brains. How much know-how fits in a society? Well, it depends on how different is the know-how you put in different brains. So I would put it to you that knowledge in the world is expanding exponentially. It's expanding really fast. But our individual ability to know is not. Like, it's not that, I don't know, Adam Smith had a small brain and now we're much smarter than Adam Smith. We are no smarter than Adam Smith or Isaac Newton or Albert Einstein, right? Why is it that we're so much more productive, able to do so much more in the world? It's not because our brains are now great and so on. It's because this enormous increase in knowledge has led to the division of knowledge, to put different bits of knowledge in different heads. So your dentist tends not to be your lawyer, right?
Yes.
Right? So you put different bits of knowledge in different heads. And then when you want to use the knowledge, you have to kind of like bring the necessary heads back together again. So it's kind of like you split it up and then you have to put Humpty Dumpty back together again in a different shape. So that's my image of the economy and how the economy grows. So one metaphor I like to use is to say that this atoms of knowledge, this amount of knowledge that fits in a head, I like to call it not a gigabyte of knowledge or a megabyte of knowledge or a terabyte of knowledge. I don't know what's the unit, so I call it a person byte of knowledge. So knowledge that fits in a head, right? What has happened is that we have enormously increased the knowledge in the world. So we need to put it in different heads, different letters, different kinds of knowledge, okay? So it's like a game of Scrabble. You use letters to make words. Words are the things we make in the world, the products. And letters are these units of knowledge that we use, these person bytes, okay? So the way the economy does is it has people deciding to make a word and putting the letters together to make that word. That is, putting the necessary knowledge to make that thing. And so the growth process is this process of increasing the diversity of letters in the economy. And that allows you to make more words. That increases the diversity of what you are able to produce. And longer words. Things that are kind of harder to make, that require a bigger network of humans collaborating, sharing their knowledge to make things. Okay, and so that's in my mind how I reinterpret the economy, and then I try to look at data for the world to kind of indicate, what's been happening to the knowledge that the economy has. How can I infer the amount of knowledge the economy is using? How can I infer the growth of that knowledge, etc.? We can talk about that.
Yeah, so just before we go there, I mean, and it's a really interesting, and your argument, Ricardo, is that the way we currently, measure that, quantify that in traditional neoclassical economics, it just can't measure that. It can measure level of education at school or average level of education at school, and it can measure, as you say, this fuzzy thing we call technology, but that that complex systems view of the economy where knowledge is key inside different people's heads. Neoclassical just cannot capture that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that if you can tweak it, it might. I'm sure that some mathematician can tweak it enough to make it say something, but it hasn't been a focus of attention. Some people have been trying to look at. There's this space of knowledge. How can we go about measuring it, etc. So I'm hope to have an impact on mainstream economics in my work. So I'm not trying to create a kind of like a new science. I think all sciences are, in some sense, they have family relations. They're deeply related. There's an ultimate reality out there that we're trying to uncover. But it has been a little bit of a slug to try to make this into to move these topics into the mainstream.
So once you form the view on the importance of information and those three different types of information, tell us about the research. Tell us about the data. What data did you look at and what did you find?
So notice knowledge is different from information in some sense. Right?
Okay, yeah.
But that's a deep philosophical question. We don't have to go there. So, for example, if I want to know what does a society know how to do, well, you can look at what it does, because if it does something, it means that it knows how to do it. So I can look at what a society knows how to do by looking at what it does. And that's easily observable. So I can look at production, say, okay, can look at how different are the different things that a society produces. So if I go to, I don't know, subsistence farming family in Mexico, they're going to plant some corn, they're going to plant some beans, they're going to have a couple of chickens out there, maybe plant some peppers and some tomatoes, and more or less every family does that and knows how to do that. So they're all self-sufficient, and they have in their head sort of like a full copy of all the technology of that place. So there's going to be relatively low diversification of production and relatively low differentiation in the work different people do.
Yes.
They're all more or less doing the same. If you look at an Inuit in northern Canada, they all know how to hunt, they all know how to fish, they'll know how to make an igloo, they all know how to make a dog sled. That's kind of like the technology that they're using. It fits in a person's head. There's very little division of labor. Okay. As I look at you, I see you using glasses, using a headphone, using a microphone, using a shirt, using a suit. You don't know how to make any of that.
Too right.
You don't know how to make any of that. It's okay. You cannot do your job without all of these things, right?
Yeah.
But you yourself don't know how to do these things. So it means that other people know how to do these things. The people are doing extremely different things, right?
Yes.
So we can measure how different are the things that people do, and we can measure how we have different ways of getting to how difficult it is to do the things that people do. One simple way is to say, if something is easy to do, kind of everybody can do it. So I'm going to find it everywhere. It's going to be very ubiquitous. If it's something is relatively hard to do, say like an airplane or an X-ray machine or mRNA vaccine, it's going to be made in few places. And only those places that can mobilize all the knowledge necessary to make these complex goods. So in how ubiquitous is a product, there's information about how easy it is to make it. If the product is very ubiquitous, it must not be that difficult to make. There are other ways of doing it. You can just look at either how long is the value chain or how diverse is the workforce that firm needs. So, for example, in a modern firm these days, you need somebody to know about accounting, another one to know about finance, another one to know about procurement, production, human resource management, branding, marketing, logistics, taxes, contracts, right? So a modern corporation integrates specialized knowledge in all of these areas to operate, right? So we can look in different ways at the data that's already there. By the way, the data has always been there, but we were not asking the question about how much knowledge is being mobilized. So we didn't process the data that way. So the typical way economists use data about economic activity is by what they call aggregating it, which is just adding it up. So you have apples and oranges and onions and so on. So you say, how can I sum up apples and oranges? Well, let's just sum them up in terms of their monetary value, and we add it all up, and it gives me GDP.
Yep.
So in the process of adding all up, you lost all the information of what it is that you were adding up.
Yes.
But in some sense, you had that information. You just did not process that information, trying to look at this other dimension of what it is that you know how to do. So that's what I've been trying to do with a bunch of co-authors over many, many years, 20 some years, and it has led me to a way of measuring how much knowledge people have, how much knowledge countries have, or cities have, or states have, provinces, how much knowledge is embedded in a product, in a good, in an industry, right? And trying to understand how countries diversify, how do they move from the things that they know how to do to things that they weren't doing before. How is that process of innovation or diversification, how does it happen? And for example, let me give you a quick insight on that. If I give you this classification problem, classify these three animals, bear, lion, and zebra. Tell me which one is out of the group.
Yeah, I put the bear out of the group because the others are in
because
Africa.
you'd say the lion and the zebra are in Africa, etc. But if you use this Scrabble approach, this letter approach, right, that letters and words, you'll realize that a zebra is just like a bear with an extra Z, right? So B-E-A-R and a Z, you can do zebra. So the distance between bear and zebra is just one letter. But if you start with bear and you want to go to lion, you start with 4 letters that you don't need, and you need 4 letters that you don't have. Yes. So actually, cognitively, if you want, in this letter space, bear and zebra are close, bear and lion are far. If you use that intuition, we can now suddenly give very precise meaning to what's his last name? A big theoretical biologist and founding father of complexity. Stuart Kaufman. Stu Kaufman, what he calls the adjacent possible. We can give that very precise meaning in economics to, given what a society knows how to do, what things it doesn't currently know how to do are in the adjacent possible. That is very few letters away, or maybe recombinations of what they already have. So we can give very precise answers to that question, and that helps orient countries in terms of how they could possibly expand their knowledge set and grow.
So let's talk about some specifics here in terms of Australia and somewhere else like Germany. Let's have a look at some of your data, Ricardo, because I love this concept that you're basically saying that if a country knows how to do certain things, it can't suddenly jump to do these dramatically different things because the knowledge, am I using the right term there? Is the knowledge, not the information. Yes. The knowledge is not in the economy to allow the economy to essentially flex like that. So can we have a look at some of your data, and we can tell the listener where to find this. But let's start with Australia. Let's look at what Australia does, and talk about what it could do, and contrast it with somewhere like Germany.
I mean, we can contrast it with Germany. I like to compare Australia to Austria.
Okay,
Because you say
let's
Austria.
let's do that.
Australia, in letter space, they look very close to each other, right?
Yes, I like that. Let's do that. So what's the website?
Yeah.
We'll put a link in the show notes, but what's the website
Yeah.
that listeners should go to?
It's atlas.hks.harvard.edu.
Okay, so when they get there, where do they need to go, Ricardo?
They can go to Explore, or they can go to Countries and Country Profiles. The country profile is kind of like an automatic version of an introduction to the country in the way we describe it and the way we think about it. And it will go from describing the level of complexity of the country and what it does and how it's been growing and how it's been doing. And then what's in the adjacent possible, which things are sexy among the adjacent possible, and we'll end up with a recommendation of what things you might want to consider focusing on next.
Okay.
But the Explore function, it's not an automatic function, it's a manual function. So you can do a lot of things there. It lets you make 7 different kinds of graphs, and you tell it what graph you want to be doing. So you tell it what country you want to look at, it will tell you what's the composition of the country's exports. We like to look at exports because these are the things you are good enough to be able to sell outside of your country. Okay? So it's a good indication that you really have mastered it. You know how to do it. So the first thing it will show you the composition of your exports. So if you look at the composition of the exports of Austria, they are amazingly diversified. There's all a bunch of little boxes in this graph that covers everything from automotives, from machines, chemicals, electronics, everything
Vaccines.
in the world, even agricultural products and so on. Vaccines. So they make a hell of a lot of things. If you, instead of choosing Austria, you choose Australia, you'll find that it is doing very, very few things, mostly minerals, right? Coal, iron ore, and some agricultural products, etc. So when you look at the complexity of the things that Australia is good at, Australia has specialized in very low complexity products.
Digging stuff out of the ground, essentially, and agriculture.
Digging stuff out of the ground. I mean, I have a theory of Australia, and actually we're actively working in this field. For us, it's trying to understand the economic consequences of remoteness. And, and I think
go on. Yeah, this is interesting.
We can talk about that. But the thing the website is going to allow you to look at what it is that you're exporting, how fast these things have been growing or not growing, and so on. So you can look at over time the evolution of these things. You can look at by product or by destination, which destination country you have been looking at. You can also choose a country and a product, and they will tell you where are you exporting that particular product and so on. So that's another thing you can do. A completely different thing you can do is try to look at what you know how to do in some kind of knowledge space. Some knowledge space in which, for example, bear and zebra would be relatively close to each other, and bear and lion would be far away from each other. That's something we call the product space, and that's one of the graphs that this thing allows you to look at. So one metaphor I like to use is that this product space is like a forest where every product is like a tree. So that's a representation of technology, the things we know how to do, and they are in that forest located in such a way that things that are nearby in some knowledge space are going to be nearby in this representation of the forest. And then a country So this map is just a map of technology. Now, what would make it a map of Venezuela or the map of Australia or the map of Austria is the fact that each country possesses firms that have mastered different parts of this technology space. So we call these firms that have mastered these things, we call them monkeys. And so the question is, where in the forest are your monkeys?
Yes.
Okay.
Great, yeah.
And that graph is going to show you where in the forest are the Australian monkeys, where in the forest are the Austrian monkeys, where in the forest are the Venezuelan monkeys. If you want to feel good about Australia, go look at Venezuela and you'll realize that Australia has much more knowledge than Venezuela.
I just have, yeah. Venezuela is very much digging things out of the ground as well, but it's 77% of Venezuelan's economy is petroleum oils and crude.
Yeah. So, and we produce less and less of it. So, that's the representation that we make of the country, and then we can ask the question: what's in your adjacent possible? And this is what we call diversification opportunities, and we'll show you in terms of how easy it is for you to move in a certain place and how sexy it would be for you to move. And we have a couple of metrics of how attractive or how sexy it would be to move to that particular industry or product. So that's what that website does, and it's, I think, a good representation of how we want to think about the economy, right? As what is the knowledge it's currently using, and how could it expand its knowledge? The idea of moving to the adjacent possible is that if you want to make watches, you need watchmakers. But how do you become a watchmaker in a country that doesn't make watches?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you start doing things you weren't doing before? If to do them, you have to know how to do them, but you don't know how to do the things you don't do.
So how do you do it?
Right? So one thing is that, you try to go to things that involve fewer of these chicken and egg problems. So maybe things where the one chicken and egg problem is, okay, you lack a watchmaker. Maybe if you bring in a watchmaker from abroad, now you have one watchmaker. And now if that watchmaker works with a few assistants, maybe over the course of a few years, you'll have other watchmakers, right? So you need to kind of like infect the system with that knowledge, and you want that knowledge to move from brain to brain. But as I said before, it takes 10,000 hours to become good at something, quoting Malcolm Gladwell. So that knowledge is going to move very slowly from brain to brain, but it can move very quickly if you just move the brain. Mm-hmm. So we find that human migration is fundamental for technological mobility. That is, technology is a bunch of tools, it's a bunch of codes, recipes, formulas, but it requires a bunch of know-how or tacit knowledge in brains. And this know-how, the tacit knowledge in brains, is the slow-moving variable that is the thing that determines the speed of the process, because it's the slowest moving thing. And that's why countries tend to move to nearby products in this cognitive sense, and why moving people has such outsized effects in terms of what a society knows how to do.
So that's an incredible way to think about it. So that you're saying with your adjacent possible is what really is critical or really important here. And for somewhere like Australia, where the skill set is dominated by digging things out of the ground in terms of economic exports, the adjacent possible for us is quite limited. There's only certain things we can do. Whereas Austria, who's got does loads of stuff, they've got lots of monkeys in different parts of the forest. They can jump to a different tree and start doing something that's a little bit different to what they already do, but they have the ability to do that. Whereas we in Australia, it would be quite a jump for us to go from mining to producing certain vaccines, for example. That would be a big step. And does that explain why the you mentioned Latin America and the economy's not doing as well there as we maybe would like? Is it because their adjacent possible is quite limited and they can't get migration working to bring in the brains? Is that part of what's happening there, Ricardo? I mean, it's obviously more complex than that, but is that an element in it?
Well, I must say Latin America did a lot of progress when Europe was doing very poorly, because it was very easy to attract Europeans to Latin America, say in the 1920s, 1940s, 1950s. And so my own country, Venezuela, had about 7% of the population was European born in the 1950s, 1960. And they were not particularly educated, but they brought with them a lot of different knowledge sets, right? So Venezuela not only became very good in Italian restaurants and Spanish restaurants, and the Portuguese brought a culture of bread making, but the Italians brought construction, working with wood, working with stone, working with iron, so this infusion of know-how had big effects in terms of diversification and growth. There's an aspect of the product space. When you see a product space, some parts of the product space are very dense. That is, it's sort of like the trees are very close to each other. And other parts of the product space are more sparse, like the trees are farther away from each other. So if you somehow get yourself into a part of the product space where the trees are very close to each other, then monkeys can jump very quickly from tree to tree. But if you're specialized in kind of like the parts of the product space that are very sparse, then the monkeys are going to have a lot of difficulty moving from tree to tree. So if you look at countries that grew very quickly, like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Korea, Singapore, eventually China, Thailand, they started in garments. And garments is a very dense part of the product space. If you know how to make one kind of garment, you can figure out how to make other kinds of garments.
Garments, yeah. Yep.
And in order for you to do that, you need to bring in materials in, say textiles in, and you put them in an industrial zone and bring workers in and out, and bring power and water, and maybe you have to working port and so on. So you develop all of these skills, all of these letters, if you want. And then if you ask yourself, gee, could I go to electronic assembly? Well, kind of like assembling a garment looks like assembling an electronic piece. So you move from garments to electronics, or garments to textiles, and from electronics and garments, they start making some machines, maybe motorcycles, eventually cars, and so that you're moving. The monkey is moving very gradually over parts of highly connected trees in the product space. So manufacturing generated kind of like a highway in which the monkey can make a lot of progress, not because he's going to jump very far, but because he's going to make a lot of small jumps.
Yes.
In other parts of the product space, like oil is this thing that's out there in the periphery. If you're good at oil, it means you know how to make holes on the ground. If anybody needs a hole on the ground, they'll give you a call. In sedimentary rocks and so on, but not many people need that. So it's not like if you know how to make one kind of machine, you can figure out how to make other kinds of machines. But if you know how to make holes on the ground, it doesn't prepare you for too many other things. So one of the problems of Australia and Latin America is that they are in a very poorly positioned part of the product space. So the monkeys do not have too many diversification opportunities nearby. So one thing we measure is how well positioned is the country in the product space. We call that the complexity outlook index. Sometimes we call it the open forest index. It's so how green is your valley around your monkeys? How rich with diversification opportunities are your monkeys endowed with, given where they are? And there we find that many parts in Latin America and Australia are very poorly positioned in the product space. They don't have many easy diversification opportunities. Now, there is a member of...
Yeah. Do we know why that is?
Because raw materials tend to be things that you dig out of the ground, tend to be activities that are relatively easy to do in a godforsaken place, because mining happens in whatever, we had an opportunity to work on Australia, on the province of Western Australia, that I remember the following statistic. It's something like 45% of Australia's landmass. Mm-hmm. It's 8% of Australia's population.
Yep.
And it's something like 50% of Australia's exports.
Yes.
So 50% of Australia's exports comes from Western Australia. And it's done by this 8% of people, but it's not in Perth. God did not put all the mineral resources in Perth. It put it in Pilbara and in some other places that are dry as hell and complicated. So the Australians are geniuses at being able to mobilize a bunch of really adventurous people to dig stuff out of the ground in really barren, godforsaken places. But that means that it's something that does not need a very complex ecosystem to be able to produce it. If you want to make a movie, just look at the credits at the end of a movie. It's not only that there are all the actors, but there's sound effect, photography, setting, clothing, special effects, sound effects, original music, the script. It's a whole lot of different person bites in this language, right? Different specialties that come together to make a movie. And that's why movies tend to be made in very few places. They're made in Los Angeles, and Vancouver is trying to get into the act, or Nollywood in Nigeria, and Bollywood in India.
Yeah.
And so but it's these things that require a very deep human network to be able to produce them there. Mining, by definition, has to be produced wherever God put it, or geology put it, or the tectonic plates put it. And it has to be simple enough so that, it can be done without that network of people. Now, the Australians are remarkably good at mining. And I say it because Australia had not been discovered by the Western world when Latin America was a major mining place. Right? Now, there are Australian multinationals, and there are essentially no Latin American multinationals in mining. That means that Australia is so good at mining that it can mine anywhere. And we're so bad at mining that we need the Australians to help us dig stuff out. So I don't want to say that mining is that simple, because we need you guys. We need you guys, right? So, but I think that that's a little bit what's going on. I wanted to say something about remoteness, though.
Yes.
We have this report that we are writing, and it's so rich that every time that I think I'm ready to publish, there's another thing we want to add to it, and I'm super excited about it. But it's this idea that places, some pixels of a map, if you want, are close to a lot of stuff, and other pixels in the map are super isolated. Like if you look at planet Earth, in most places humans don't live. Humans like to live right next to each other, right? And we spend our time in traffic because we all want to be next to each other instead of, I mean, right? And that tells you a little bit about how much we need to interact in order to do what we want to do. It shows how it is human interactions require proximity, because we, in my mind, we need to mobilize that knowledge. You need all the other people who know to do the things you don't know how to do, but you need to survive, right? So human agglomerations have been the trend, right? We live more and more in cities and in large cities and so on. We can define remoteness at the level of a country, and there Australia is super remote because the only reasonably sized economy nearby is New Zealand, and it's not that nearby, right? It's like a 3-hour flight or something like that.
Yep.
Right? And I don't know, Indonesia must be a 7-hour flight, or right? So I don't know. It's huge distances, right? So there's nothing nearby. We find that remoteness hurts development.
Okay.
So in general, more remote areas tend to be poorer. So what's around you affects what you can do. And so remote areas tend to be poorer. And in that sense, Australia is an outlier because it's super remote, but it's not poor. But we find that remoteness affects income per capita through its impact on economic complexity, through its impact on how much knowledge the society mobilizes. That about 80% of the impact of remoteness on prosperity goes through its impact on complexity, on how much knowledge gets mobilized. And we think that has to do with the fact that, as your society is trying to put these letters together, the more letters you have to bring together, the more likely it is that you don't have that letter in your town, and you have to bring it in. And the farther you are, the costlier it is to bring it in.
Yeah.
So the more complex things are punished more by remoteness. They're harder to do in a remote place. So that's why I think both you and New Zealand are kind of like trapped in this low complexity world, even though I think that there are ways out of it that I'm sure Australia and New Zealand are going to find or have found, because you guys are remarkably rich by Latin American standards, even though you're even more remote than Latin America. Right. So I think that there's an interesting interaction between geography and economics that goes through complexity.
So Ricardo, just to finish, what's the adjacent possible for Australia? What does that look like at the moment?
Well, to answer your question, I'm going to get into the website. I'm choosing the atlas. I'm going to countries. I'm going to country profiles, and I hit Australia as the country. It's telling me that Australia is going in the wrong direction. Its complexity is declining. A member of the Australian Parliament once wrote an op-ed when we published an update of the atlas, saying it was, I think the title was "Dirty, Dumb, and Getting Dumber."
Wow.
That was his description of Australia. So Australia has this idea that it's been losing its automotive industry. It's been losing some of its more complex parts of the economy. But this tells me that in the growth opportunities, there are quite a few interesting things. If you ask me about the adjacent possible, that's the last thing in the country profile. It gives you a list of things that are nearby. Mm-hmm. I'm going to mention a few complex ones that I find interesting. Our aircraft launching gear, peptones, I don't know what they are. nuclear reactors and related equipment, that seems to be nearby, catalytic preparations, acrylic polymers, um, um, phenols, phenol alcohols, instruments for measuring properties of liquids or gases. So you see spark ignition, reciprocating internal combustion piston engines. I don't know if that had to do with your old car industry that remains there. But the lubricants. So I find a lot of interesting stuff in your adjacent possible. For some reason, the market hasn't been kind of like encouraging that kind of activity. So that's why the monkeys are not there yet, or maybe they're very small there. But in any case, play around with it. I'm sure that it's a different way of thinking about what in what direction you could potentially steer the economy. Let me say one thing about Australia's future. Everybody's talking about the climate change, about the energy transition, and there's this whole process, the Paris Accord. It says, we are emitting too much. Everyone is contributing, so we all need to cooperate. So let's all focus on lowering our emissions. So you lower your emissions, I lower my emissions, everybody lowers their emissions. Focus on what you can do to lower your emissions. And if we all do that, then the world will have lowered its emissions. I think this is a very partial way of thinking about the problem. An alternative way to think about the problem is that the world needs to lower its emissions. For the world to lower its emissions, the world is going to need a lot of stuff that will allow it to lower its emissions. So if you can make your country a supplier of the things that a decarbonizing world will need, the more they want to decarbonize, the more you sell, the more you grow. That's what we call green growth. And Australia has a very interesting role to play in a world that wants to decarbonize in two dimensions. The first dimension is that Australia can produce the things that a decarbonizing world will need, starting with the critical minerals. So, for example, you're the largest world producer of lithium, and a decarbonizing world will need electric vehicles, batteries for grid-scale batteries, a lot of batteries for many things to store the electricity, because we're very good at solar energy, at making solar panels, but electricity, it's very hard to store and to move around. So you can get in all the value chains that end up in the equipments that allow for this energy transition. We call that strategy one. And the second strategy has to do with the fact that oil is incredibly dense, both from a volume point of view and from a weight point of view. A kilo of oil, a liter of oil, packs an enormous amount of energy. You can say the same thing about coal. Okay? But solar energy, wind energy, and so on don't share that property. So the fact that oil and coal are so dense, it means that it's super cheap to transport them. Mm-hmm. And that feature made the world energetically flat, in the sense that if a barrel of oil costs $80 in Saudi Arabia, or $70 these days in Saudi Arabia, it'll cost $72 in Tokyo. It will cost $73 in Australia, right? So it's very, very cheap to move around. And that meant that the local availability of energy was not an important determinant of comparative advantage in energy-intensive goods. So who makes steel in this world? Japan, South Korea, China, Germany, Belgium. They make steel, they don't have energy. They just bring the energy in. In a decarbonizing world that wants to use clean energy, green energy is very hard to move around. It's almost impossible to move around. It's incredibly costly to move around. So the way the world is going to decarbonize, it's not by sending green energy to people in energy-intensive industries where the oil world left them. Yeah. It's the energy-intensive industries that will have to move to places that have green energy, because it will be easier to move the industry than it is to move the energy. And Australia has incredible amounts of co-located sun and wind. And that's going to make it attractive to decarbonize your product by making the product in Australia.
Wow.
In places that can use sun and wind. So I'm naturally an optimist. I like to look at the possibilities in life, not at the headaches in life. So I'm more looking at what are the opportunities, what can you do next? And I think that there's plenty of exciting things that we can be doing next.
Ricardo, thank you very much for being on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.